A cop watches as a black boy walks 20 miles to school every single day, no matter the weather. At first, he assumes the boy is just up to no good, but something about the way he pushes forward, exhausted but determined, makes him curious. So one morning, the cop decides to follow him, and what he discovers shatters him completely. Because this isn't just a long walk, it's a fight for survival, a battle against hunger, neglect, and a cruel system that has failed him. But when the cop finally steps in, will it be too late? Or will he be the one person who refuses to let this boy suffer alone? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Darkness wrapped around Malik like a familiar blanket as he eased the front door closed, wincing at even the smallest click of the latch. The pre-dawn air bit through his thin gray hoodie, making him shiver. His worn backpack hung loose on his shoulders, practically empty except for a single notebook and a stubby pencil he'd found on the playground last week. His stomach growled, loud in the quiet morning. Malik pressed a hand against it, trying to silence the sound even though no one was around to hear. He hadn't eaten since lunch yesterday at school, and that had only been half a sandwich the cafeteria lady had slipped him when no one was looking. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Malik started walking. 20 miles stretched ahead of him, a distance that would have seemed impossible to most kids his age. But Malik had done this walk so many times he could probably do it in his sleep. He had to. Mr. Holloway refused to drive him, claiming gas cost too much, even though Malik knew the state sent money for exactly that purpose. As he walked, Malik kept his head down, shoulders hunched against the cold. The neighborhood was still asleep, curtains drawn tight across windows, only the occasional cat prowling between parked cars. His shoes, 2 sizes too small and worn at the toes, scraped against the concrete with each step. The sky slowly lightened from black to deep blue as he made his way through the quiet streets. His legs already ached, but he pushed forward. Being late wasn't an option. Mr. Holloway had made that crystal clear after the last time the school called home about his tardiness. When Malik reached the first bus stop, he quickly crossed to the other side of the street. Yellow buses would start their routes soon, picking up kids whose parents actually cared whether they got to school safely. He'd learned early on to avoid those stops. Last month, Jimmy Parker had pointed at him and laughed. "Look at the charity case. Can't even afford bus fare." The other kids had joined in, their taunts following Malik down the street. He'd wanted to tell them that it wasn't about money. The state paid for his bus pass too. But Mr. Holloway had kept that, just like he kept everything else meant for Malik. The sun was starting to peek over the horizon when Malik reached the industrial part of town. Here, the sidewalks disappeared, forcing him to walk along the shoulder of the highway. His heart pounded every time a car zoomed past, the rush of air threatening to knock him over. A massive truck blasted its horn as it passed, the sound so sudden and loud that Malik stumbled. He lost his footing on the gravel shoulder and tumbled into the drainage ditch. Pain shot through his knee as it scraped against broken concrete, but he bit back the cry that wanted to escape. The truck driver didn't even slow down. Malik's hands trembled as he pulled himself up, checking the damage. His jeans were torn, blood seeping through the new hole, but it wasn't too bad. He'd had worse. At least the fall hadn't damaged his backpack. Mr. Holloway wouldn't give him another one if this one broke. Blue and red lights reflected off the guardrail, making Malik freeze. A police car crawled past, the officer inside studying him through the window. Malik kept his eyes down, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop," he silently pleaded. The car continued on its way, and Malik let out the breath he'd been holding. Just another black kid walking where he shouldn't be. The sun was fully up by the time the school building came into view. Malik's legs felt like lead, and sweat had soaked through his hoodie despite the morning chill. But relief flooded through him as he climbed the front steps. Here at least he could pretend to be normal for a few hours. The hallways were already filling with students as he made his way to his classroom. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the familiar smell of chalk dust and floor cleaner wrapping around him like a welcome hug. This was his sanctuary, the only place where he felt like more than just a paycheck for the Holloways. "Malik?" He looked up to find Mrs. Bennett watching him from her desk, her forehead creased with concern. She was new this year, still young enough to care, still paying attention when kids showed up looking wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes taking in his disheveled appearance, the tear in his jeans, the exhaustion he couldn't quite hide. Malik felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes, but he forced it back. He couldn't cry. Crying meant questions, and questions meant Mr. Holloway would find out someone was asking about him. Instead, he pulled his lips into what he hoped looked like a genuine smile. "Yeah," he said, the lie familiar on his tongue. "I'm good." Days later, Officer Daniel Grayson shifted in his patrol car seat, trying to find a comfortable position as he nursed his second coffee of the morning. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the gas station's weathered sign in soft orange light. He lifted the paper cup to his lips, grimacing at the bitter taste of the cheap brew. Movement caught his attention, a small figure walking along the highway's shoulder, barely visible in the early morning light. Grayson straightened, coffee forgotten. Kids weren't supposed to be out here, not at this hour, not alone. The nearest residential area was miles away. He squinted through the windshield. The child couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, wearing what looked like a thin hoodie despite the morning chill. A backpack hung from narrow shoulders, and even from this distance, Grayson could see the careful way the kid placed each step, like someone trying to conserve energy for a long journey. 20 years on the force had taught Grayson to trust his instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming that something wasn't right. He set his coffee in the cup holder and started the car, but didn't turn on his lights. No need to spook the kid just yet. Keeping a careful distance, Grayson followed as the boy left the highway, cutting through a series of narrow alleys between old warehouses. The kid moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the route. This wasn't some child who had wandered off course. This was a practiced journey. A delivery truck roared past far too close to where the boy walked. Grayson's hand tightened on the steering wheel as he watched the kid stumble into a ditch. But before he could respond, the boy picked himself up and kept walking, favoring one leg slightly but otherwise showing no reaction to what must have been a painful fall. "Dispatch," Grayson spoke into his radio, keeping his voice low even though the boy was too far away to hear. "Can you check for any missing children reports in the last 24 hours? Black male, approximately 10 years old, gray hoodie, carrying a backpack." The response came back quickly. "Negative on missing persons matching that description, Officer Grayson." He frowned, watching as the boy navigated another dangerous intersection. No missing persons report could mean many things, none of them good. Either no one had noticed this kid was gone, or worse, they knew exactly where he was and didn't care. The journey continued for what seemed like an eternity. Grayson checked his odometer. They'd covered nearly 15 miles already. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten in its holder, as he tracked the small figure's progress through the awakening city. The boy never stopped to rest, never looked around for landmarks, just kept moving with the same determined pace. Finally, a school building came into view. Grayson parked across the street, watching as the boy climbed the front steps. In the full morning light, the child's condition was more apparent. His clothes were worn and ill-fitting, hanging loose on a frame that was too thin for his height. The way he moved spoke of exhaustion, but there was something else. A wariness in how he held himself, how he scanned his surroundings before entering the building. Grayson pulled out his notebook, jotting down his observations. 20 years of police work had taught him to recognize the signs of neglect, and this kid was practically a textbook case. No child should have to walk 20 miles to school. No child should look that hungry in a country with free school lunch programs. He spent the morning making calls, checking records, trying to piece together who this kid might be. But without more information, there wasn't much to go on. Schools wouldn't release student information without cause, and cops' gut feeling didn't qualify as probable cause. When the final bell rang that afternoon, Grayson was back in his spot across from the school. He watched the buses fill up, watched parents arrive in cars to collect their children. But the boy in the gray hoodie didn't board a bus. Instead, he emerged from the building and started walking, the same route in reverse. Grayson's jaw clenched as he watched the small figure disappear around the corner. He'd seen a lot in his years on the force, had grown a thick skin out of necessity. But something about this situation dug under that protective layer. touched a nerve he thought he'd buried long ago. He made a decision then, picking up his cold coffee cup and crushing it in his hand. Tomorrow, he'd be here again. He'd follow the same route, gather more information. This wasn't just a kid taking the long way to school. This was something else entirely. And Daniel Grayson had never been very good at ignoring problems once they caught his attention. The setting sun cast long shadows across his dashboard as he made notes in his log. Distance traveled, approximately 20 miles each way. Time of morning departure, before sunrise. Estimated age, 10 to 11 years. Visible signs of neglect, ill-fitting clothes, apparent hunger, possible physical exhaustion. No adult supervision noted. Each detail he wrote down only strengthened his resolve. Tomorrow, he'd get to the bottom of this. Tomorrow, he'd find out who this kid was and why he was walking 40 miles a day just to get an education. Tomorrow, he'd start figuring out how to help, because that's what had drawn him to police work in the first place, not the badge or the authority, but the chance to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And right now, there was a kid out there who needed protecting, whether he knew it or not. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Malik started his journey to school. His legs felt like lead, each step requiring more effort than the last. The familiar gnawing in his stomach had turned into sharp cramps that made him pause occasionally, pressing his hand against his middle, as if that could somehow ease the pain. Last night's confrontation with Brenda Holloway played on repeat in his mind. He'd made the mistake of lingering in the kitchen too long, hoping she might offer him something more than the single slice of bread she'd tossed his way. Her eyes had narrowed, lips curling into that familiar sneer he'd grown to dread. "You already get food at school," she'd snapped, her manicured nails drumming against the kitchen counter. "What, you think you're special?" The words had stung, but not as much as the hunger. Malik had learned early in his stay with the Holloways that asking for more meant getting even less. So he'd taken his piece of bread and retreated to his room, trying to make the small morsel last as long as possible. Now, as he trudged through the morning darkness, his body protested every movement. His worn sneakers scraped against the pavement, the sound seeming unusually loud in the quiet dawn. The familiar route stretched endlessly before him, each landmark that usually helped mark his progress now feeling impossibly far apart. By the time he reached the school, his uniform shirt was damp with sweat despite the morning chill. The fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed too bright, making his eyes water as he made his way to his classroom. Other students brushed past him, their voices a distant buzz in his ears. Malik slid into his seat, the hard plastic chair offering no comfort to his aching body. He tried to focus on Mrs. Henderson's voice as she began the morning's math lesson, but the numbers on the board kept swimming before his eyes. The room felt too warm, then too cold. His pencil trembled in his hand as he attempted to copy down the equations. The first wave of dizziness hit him like a physical blow. Malik gripped the edges of his desk, trying to steady himself. The classroom seemed to tilt and spin, Mrs. Henderson's voice growing fainter as if she were speaking from the end of a long tunnel. Dark spots danced at the edges of his vision. "Malik." Mrs. Henderson's concerned voice barely registered. "Are you feeling all right?" He tried to nod to force out his usual "I'm fine," but his tongue felt too heavy in his mouth. The last thing he saw was his classmates' startled faces as the room tilted sideways and everything went black. Chaos erupted in the classroom. Children's voices rose in alarm as Malik slumped forward onto his desk. Mrs. Henderson rushed to his side, her face pale with concern as she checked his pulse. Someone ran to get the school nurse while another teacher ushered the frightened students into the hallway. The nurse arrived within minutes, her experienced hands quickly assessing Malik's condition. She frowned as she felt his clammy skin, noted his shallow breathing. When she lifted his eyelids to check his pupils, Malik stirred slightly but didn't fully regain consciousness. "He's severely dehydrated," the nurse announced, her voice tight with professional concern. "And from what I can tell, he hasn't eaten properly in quite some time." The school counselor, Ms. Martinez, stood in the doorway, wringing her hands. She'd been watching Malik for weeks, noting his increasing lethargy, the way his clothes hung looser on his frame. But every time she'd tried to talk to him, he'd withdrawn further into himself. "Malik's in foster care," she said quietly, her words heavy with implication. And it's not good. We've had concerns, but without concrete evidence. She trailed off as heavy footsteps approached from the hallway. Officer Grayson appeared in the doorway, his face transforming from casual concern to barely contained fury as he took in the scene before him. He'd come to check on the boy he'd been following, hoping to catch him before classes started. Instead, he found a medical emergency. Something in Grayson's expression hardened as he listened to the nurse list off Malik's symptoms. Each detail, the malnutrition, the dehydration, the physical exhaustion, felt like a personal accusation. He'd known something was wrong, had seen the signs, but hadn't acted quickly enough. When Malik was finally moved to the nurse's office, Grayson followed. He watched as the nurse got some fluids into the boy, saw color slowly return to his ashen face. Malik's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear briefly visible before his expression settled into its usual careful blank mask. Grayson moved closer, crouching down beside the narrow cot where Malik lay. The boy's hands clutched the thin sheet covering him, knuckles white with tension. He looked even smaller up close, more vulnerable than any child should ever have to be. "Kid," Grayson said softly, keeping his voice gentle despite the anger burning in his chest. "Tell me the truth. What's going on at home?" He saw the conflict play across Malik's face, the desire to speak warring with deeply ingrained fear. The boy's eyes darted around the room, checking exits, assessing threats, displaying the kind of survival instincts no child should need to develop. Finally, Malik shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing. I'm fine." The words were clearly rehearsed, a protective mantra that had probably kept him safe more times than Grayson wanted to imagine. But the officer didn't buy it for a second. He saw the way Malik's shoulders hunched, how he seemed to make himself smaller, less noticeable. These were the instincts of a child who had learned that attention usually meant pain. Grayson maintained his crouch beside the cot, careful not to make any sudden movements. He understood why Malik wouldn't trust him. Cops hadn't exactly proven themselves trustworthy in the boy's experience. They were just another group of adults who had failed to notice, failed to help, failed to care. The evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Officer Grayson pulled up to the Holloway residence. The house looked like something out of a real estate magazine. Pristine white siding, neatly trimmed hedges, and cheerful flower beds lining the curved walkway. A basketball hoop stood in the driveway, and children's bikes were carefully arranged on the front porch. Everything about it screamed, perfect family home. But Grayson knew better than to trust appearances. In his years on the force, he'd learned that the prettiest facades often hid the ugliest truths. He sat in his patrol car for a moment, studying the house. The curtains in the upstairs windows twitched slightly. Someone was watching him. Taking a deep breath, Grayson stepped out of his car and approached the front door. Before he could even ring the doorbell, it swung open, revealing Tom and Brenda Holloway. They wore matching expressions of concerned surprise, their smiles wide but not quite reaching their eyes. "Oh, officer," Brenda exclaimed, one manicured hand pressed against her chest. "Is everything all right?" Her voice carried just the right note of maternal worry, but something about it felt rehearsed. Tom stood slightly behind his wife, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. "We heard about what happened at school today. Poor Malik. He probably just didn't eat his breakfast. You know how kids are." Grayson noticed how quickly they moved to explain away the incident, even before he'd mentioned why he was there. In the living room behind them, he could see their biological children sprawled on an expensive leather couch. The boy wore Nike sneakers that probably cost more than Malik's entire wardrobe, while the girl absently played with her brand new iPhone. "Mind if I come in?" Grayson asked, though it wasn't really a question. The Holloways stepped aside, their smiles never wavering. The interior of the house was as immaculate as the outside. Family photos lined the walls, mostly of the biological children, Grayson noted. Malik appeared in only one, standing stiffly at the edge of what looked like a Christmas photo. Movement on the staircase caught his attention. Malik stood there, partially hidden in the shadows of the hallway. His posture was rigid, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The contrast between him and the Holloway children was stark. While they lounged comfortably in designer clothes, Malik wore a faded t-shirt that hung loose on his thin frame, the hem frayed and collar stretched. "Malik's such a great kid," Brenda gushed, moving to stand between Grayson and the staircase. "A little shy, but we love having him here. Don't we, honey?" Tom nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. He's really become part of the family." The Holloway children on the couch exchanged glances but said nothing, their eyes fixed on Malik with an expression that made Grayson's jaw clench. It wasn't outright hostility, but rather the look of children who had been taught that someone was beneath them. "Malik," Grayson called softly, stepping around Brenda. "How are you feeling?" Before Malik could answer, Brenda jumped in. "He's much better now. I made sure he had a good meal when he got home. Didn't I, sweetie?" Malik nodded mechanically, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere near Grayson's shoes. When Tom moved to stand behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder, Malik's whole body tensed. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But Grayson saw the way the boy's shoulders hunched slightly, how he seemed to make himself smaller. "The school nurse mentioned you were dehydrated," Grayson pressed on. "That's quite a long walk to school. Why don't you take the bus?" Again, Brenda intercepted the question. "Oh, Malik prefers to walk. He's very independent, aren't you, dear? We've offered to drive him, but he insists." Grayson watched Malik's face carefully. The boy's expression remained carefully blank, but his hands had tightened into fists at his sides. Every time Grayson tried to address him directly, Brenda or Tom would smoothly interrupt, their voices dripping with rehearsed concern. "And what about meals?" Grayson asked, his eyes still on Malik. "The nurse said, 'We provide 3 healthy meals a day,'" Tom cut in, his grip on Malik's shoulder visibly tightening. "Plus snacks. Sometimes kids just forget to eat when they're busy playing." The Holloway children snickered from their place on the couch, quickly silenced by a sharp look from their mother. Grayson noticed how they were positioned, comfortable, well-fed, clearly favored. Meanwhile, Malik stood apart, like a shadow at the edges of their perfect family picture. After several more attempted questions, all expertly deflected by the Holloways, Grayson knew he wouldn't get anywhere tonight. Not with Tom and Brenda hovering, not with Malik too terrified to speak. He needed a different approach. "Well, thank you for your time," he said finally, moving toward the door. "I'm glad to see everything's okay here." As he turned to leave, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Brenda had leaned down close to Malik's ear, her lips moving in what looked like a whisper. Though Grayson couldn't hear the words, he saw their effect. Malik's face went completely still, his body rigid with tension. That moment told Grayson everything he needed to know. The perfect house, the practiced smiles, the careful answers. It was all a facade. Behind these walls, something was very wrong. Walking back to his patrol car, Grayson's hands clenched into fists. He slid behind the wheel, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. The evidence he needed wasn't here. Not yet. The Holloways were too careful, too practiced at maintaining their image. But that image had cracks, and in those cracks, Grayson had seen the truth. That night, the Holloway family dining room glowed with warm light from the crystal chandelier overhead. The polished oak table was set with fine china plates, each one bearing a perfectly cooked steak and a generous helping of creamy mashed potatoes. Steam rose from the vegetables, and the rich aroma of garlic butter filled the air. All except for one place at the table. Malik sat quietly in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. In front of him was a single slice of white bread on a paper napkin and a glass of tap water. The bread was slightly stale, its edges curling up. He kept his eyes down, trying not to look at the feast before the others. Tom cut into his steak, the knife scraping against the expensive china. "Pass the salt, honey," he said to Brenda, who smiled and handed it over. Their children chatted about their day at school, their plates piled high with second helpings. Malik's stomach growled loudly in the midst of their conversation. Nobody looked his way. Nobody offered him anything. He picked up his bread with careful fingers, taking tiny bites to make it last longer. The dry texture stuck in his throat and he took small sips of water to help it go down. Brenda's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and cold despite her pleasant expression. "You ate at school today, didn't you?" Her tone made it clear what answer she expected. Malik nodded quickly, the lie bitter in his mouth. He hadn't eaten at school. His lunch account had been empty for weeks. But he knew better than to tell the truth. Complaining meant consequences. Consequences meant no food at all tomorrow. The family continued eating, their forks clinking against plates, their conversation flowing around him as if he were invisible. The Holloway children occasionally glanced his way, smirking when their parents weren't looking. They knew the rules. They knew their place in this house, and they knew his. Hours later, when the house had grown quiet and dark, Malik lay in his bed listening to his stomach growl. The hunger was a constant companion now, a hollow ache that made it hard to sleep. He waited until he was sure everyone was asleep before sliding out from under his thin blanket. His bare feet made no sound on the carpeted hallway as he crept toward the kitchen. The house was different at night. Shadows stretched across the walls, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder. He moved carefully, the way he'd learned to move in foster homes before this one. The kitchen was bathed in the blue glow of the digital clock on the microwave. Malik approached the refrigerator, his heart pounding. He knew he shouldn't be doing this, but the hunger was too strong to ignore tonight. Opening the door as slowly as possible to prevent any noise, he squinted against the sudden light. The shelves were packed with food, leftover steak from dinner, containers of fruit, yogurt cups, cheese, and cold cuts. His mouth watered at the sight. His eyes landed on an apple in the fruit drawer. Just one piece of fruit. Surely they wouldn't notice if one was missing. His hand trembled as he reached for it, but then he stopped. Images flashed through his mind. Previous foster homes, previous punishments, previous hunger. They always noticed. They always knew. Closing the refrigerator door carefully, he spotted a package of crackers on the counter instead. He took one out, the cellophane crinkling slightly despite his best efforts to be quiet. The cracker was plain and dry, but it was something. As he turned to head back to his room, movement in the hallway made him freeze. Brenda stood there, a dark silhouette against the darker house. She didn't move, didn't speak at first, just watched him with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. "You think I don't know?" Her whisper carried across the kitchen, soft but filled with threat. "Try that again, and you'll sleep outside." Malik's shoulders hunched inward, making himself as small as possible. The cracker in his hand felt like evidence of a terrible crime. He kept his eyes on the floor as he shuffled past her, feeling her gaze boring into him all the way back to his room. Sleep didn't come easily after that. He lay in bed, the hunger now accompanied by fear, until exhaustion finally pulled him under. Morning came too soon, gray light seeping through his window. His stomach ached sharply as he got dressed in his worn clothes. The memory of last night's warning kept him from even looking toward the kitchen as he prepared for his long walk to school. Malik grabbed his backpack, its empty weight a reminder that there would be no lunch today either. He moved quietly toward the front door, careful not to wake anyone. But as he opened it, his body went rigid with surprise. There, parked at the curb, was Officer Grayson's patrol car. The cop sat in the driver's seat, waiting, his eyes fixed on the house. Malik stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, unsure whether to step outside or retreat back into the house. Behind him, he could hear the Holloways beginning to stir. Soon they would be up, and they would want to know why he hadn't left yet. But ahead of him was Grayson, whose presence promised either help or more trouble. And Malik had learned the hard way that those two things often looked the same at first. Grayson stood against his patrol car in the pale morning light, his arms crossed over his chest. The crisp air carried the scent of autumn, and his breath formed small clouds in front of him. He watched as Malik stood frozen in the doorway, the boy's thin frame tensed like a deer ready to bolt. "Need a ride?" Grayson kept his voice gentle, casual, trying not to spook the kid. He'd seen that look before, the wariness, the calculation of risk versus reward. It was the look of someone who'd learned the hard way not to trust easily. Malik's fingers tightened on his backpack straps. His worn hoodie hung loose on his small frame, and his sneakers were falling apart at the seams. The morning chill made him shiver, but he didn't move from his spot. Behind those guarded eyes, Grayson could see the internal struggle. The boy's gaze darted between the patrol car and the house behind him, weighing his options. The walk ahead was long and dangerous, but the consequences of accepting help might be worse. "I'm fine," Malik finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a tentative step forward, then another, giving the patrol car a wide berth as he started his journey. Grayson watched him go, noting how the boy's shoulders remained hunched, defensive. He waited until Malik had made it to the end of the block before sliding into his patrol car. He wouldn't force the issue, but he wasn't about to let the kid make this trek alone either. The morning traffic was starting to pick up as Grayson followed at a distance, keeping Malik's small figure in sight. The boy moved with purpose, clearly familiar with his route. He ducked into alleyways and cut through empty lots, taking shortcuts that spoke of countless mornings spent finding the quickest path. Grayson's jaw clenched as he watched Malik navigate the increasingly busy streets. The boy had to detour around construction sites and dodge early morning delivery trucks. At one point, Malik squeezed through a gap in a chain-link fence, forcing Grayson to take a longer route around to keep up. The sun was climbing higher in the sky when they reached the highway section. Grayson's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he watched Malik walk along the narrow shoulder. The cars and trucks whizzed by at dangerous speeds, some of them crossing over the white line. A semi-truck blasted its horn as it passed, causing Malik to stumble toward the ditch. The sound echoed in the morning air, angry and threatening. Grayson's foot instinctively moved to the accelerator, ready to intervene, but Malik had already regained his balance and continued walking. This wasn't just a walk to school, Grayson realized. This was a gauntlet, a daily test of survival that no child should have to face. Every step carried risk, every moment held potential danger, and somewhere along the line Malik had learned to accept this as normal. When they finally reached the school, Malik practically ran through the front gates. He disappeared inside without a backward glance, leaving Grayson parked across the street, his coffee long cold and forgotten in its cup holder. The officer sat there for a long moment, watching other children arrive by bus and car, greeted by their parents' waves and calls of, "Have a good day." The contrast made his chest tight with anger. While these kids worried about homework and recess, Malik was fighting just to survive each morning. Back at the station later that afternoon, Grayson sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. The voice on the other end belonged to a Child Protective Services worker, her tone professional but detached. "We've checked the Holloway home before," she said, the sound of shuffling papers in the background. "There's nothing on record. The home passed all inspections." Grayson leaned forward, frustration evident in his voice. "But have you seen how they treat him? The kid's walking 20 miles to school, for God's sake. He's obviously malnourished." "Officer," she cut him off, "without concrete proof of abuse or neglect, we can't intervene. The Holloways are registered foster parents with a clean record. We need more than suspicions to take action." "He collapsed at school yesterday from hunger," Grayson pressed. "Isn't that enough? Was there a medical report filed? Any documentation of systematic food deprivation?" Grayson's free hand curled into a fist on his desk. "No, but..." "Then our hands are tied," she said firmly. "If you can bring us evidence, photographs, witness statements, medical documentation, we can open an investigation. But right now, there's nothing we can do." The call ended with a click, leaving Grayson sitting in frustrated silence. He didn't need proof. He'd seen enough in Malik's eyes, in his careful movements, in the way he flinched at sudden gestures. He'd seen enough in the stark difference between Malik's worn clothes and the Holloway children's designer brands. He'd seen enough in that morning walk, that daily fight for survival that no child should have to endure. Grayson hung up the phone, his jaw set in determination. The system might need proof, but he knew what he'd witnessed. The image of Malik walking alone along that dangerous highway, the sound of that truck's horn, the boy's daily struggle. It was all the evidence he needed. That day, the front door creaked as Malik stepped inside the Holloway house. His muscles ached from the long walk home, and his stomach growled with familiar emptiness. The moment he crossed the threshold, He sensed something was wrong. The air felt thick with tension like the calm before a storm. Brenda Holloway stood in the living room, her arms crossed over her designer sweater. Her lips curved into that smile Malik had learned to fear, the one that didn't reach her eyes. Tom sat in his leather armchair watching Malik with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. "You had a little chat with your cop friend today?" Brenda's voice dripped with false sweetness, each word carefully measured. The sound made Malik's skin crawl. His heart hammered against his ribs as he quickly shook his head. "No," he whispered, clutching his backpack straps tighter. The worn fabric offered no comfort, but his fingers needed something to hold on to. Tom leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. His eyes were like chips of ice, boring into Malik. "You better not," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're lucky to be here, Malik. You know where kids like you end up?" Malik's throat went dry. He did know. They'd told him countless times, painted vivid pictures of the horrors that awaited him if he ever complained. His gaze dropped to the pristine carpet beneath his feet. "You'll be in a group home," Brenda continued, circling him like a shark, "sleeping in a cell." Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her arm as she spoke. "No one wants troublemakers, Malik. No one wants ungrateful children." Tom's voice joined in, each word hammering another nail into Malik's cage of fear. "You'll be passed around like trash." He gestured to the comfortable home around them. "Is that what you want, instead of all this?" The house was beautiful, Malik had to admit. Clean floors, warm rooms, plenty of food, for everyone except him. But they made sure he believed this was better than the alternative. Better than being thrown away. Better than being nothing. That night, dinner was served as usual. The Holloway children chatted about their day while steam rose from their plates of chicken and vegetables. Malik sat at his place, but no plate appeared before him. His stomach twisted painfully as he watched them eat, the aromas of food making his mouth water. Brenda caught him looking at the food and raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong, Malik?" Her tone carried a warning. He quickly shook his head, folding his hands in his lap. The evening dragged on endlessly. Malik retreated to his room, the smallest in the house, tucked away in a corner like an afterthought. He curled up under his thin blanket, trying to find warmth in the chilly room. The space heater hummed softly in the corner, providing just enough heat to keep the cold at bay. But later, as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he heard footsteps. Through half-closed eyes, he watched Brenda slip into his room like a shadow. Her movements were deliberate as she pulled his blanket away, leaving him exposed to the cold air. The loss of warmth was immediate, making him curl tighter into himself. Tom followed shortly after, his heavy footsteps marking his presence. Without a word, he unplugged the space heater, the quiet hum dying instantly. The temperature in the room began to drop almost immediately. They never hit him. They were too smart for that. Bruises left evidence, marks that could be traced. Instead, they wielded different weapons: cold, hunger, isolation, fear. These left no visible scars, but cut just as deep. The hours crept by in darkness. Malik lay awake, his body shivering against the cold. The ceiling above him became a blank canvas for his thoughts, for the hopelessness that threatened to swallow him whole. Every creak of the house made him tense, wondering if they would return with new torments. He was trapped. The realization sat heavy in his chest, a weight he couldn't shake. The Holloways had constructed his cage carefully, built from threats and fear rather than bars and locks. They made sure he knew that speaking up meant worse suffering, that asking for help would only lead to greater pain. No one was coming to help. The thought echoed in his mind as he stared into the darkness. Even Officer Grayson, with his kind eyes and gentle offers, couldn't save him. The system wouldn't believe him. The Holloways had made sure of that. They were too good at playing their roles, too careful with their cruelty. But unknown to Malik, just down the street, a patrol car sat silently in the shadows. Inside, Officer Grayson kept his vigil, watching the darkened house. His fingers drummed restlessly on the steering wheel as he observed the Holloway home, its perfect exterior hiding the darkness within. The neighborhood was quiet. Most houses dark except for porch lights casting pools of yellow on manicured lawns. The Holloway house stood among them, indistinguishable from its neighbors. No one passing by would guess at the suffering contained within its walls. Grayson's coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't move from his post. His eyes remained fixed on the window he knew belonged to Malik's room, where no light showed. The darkness there seemed deeper somehow, heavier with the weight of secrets and silent pain. The Monday morning sun barely penetrated the thick clouds as Malik made his way through the school hallways. His footsteps dragged against the linoleum floor, each step requiring more effort than the last. The weekend had been particularly harsh. 2 days without proper food, just scraps and water. His thin frame trembled despite the warmth of the building. In his classroom, Ms. Peterson's voice seemed to come from far away, the words blending together like watercolors in the rain. "Malik, can you read the next paragraph?" He tried to focus on the textbook in front of him, but the letters danced across the page, refusing to stay still. His hands shook as he gripped the edges of his desk, trying to anchor himself to something solid. The fluorescent lights above seemed too bright, too harsh. "Malik?" Ms. Peterson's voice grew concerned. She stepped closer to his desk, her brow furrowed with worry. The room started to spin, colors and shapes blurring together like a carnival ride gone wrong. Malik's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His fingers lost their grip on the desk, and darkness crept in from the edges of his vision like curtains slowly closing. The last thing he heard was the scraping of chairs and his classmates' startled voices as his body slumped forward, consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. In the nurse's office, the stark white walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the overhead lights. Malik lay on the narrow bed, his dark skin ashen, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The school nurse, Mrs. Martinez, moved quickly and efficiently, checking his vital signs with practiced hands. Officer Grayson burst through the door, his face etched with concern. He'd been parked nearby watching the school as he had every day since noticing Malik's long walks. The call had come over his radio. Medical emergency, young student collapsed. Mrs. Martinez pulled him aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hasn't eaten in days." Her words carried both professional concern and personal outrage. "His blood sugar is dangerously low. I can feel his ribs through his shirt." Principal Warner stood in the doorway, her usual composed demeanor cracking under the weight of anger. Her hands were clenched at her sides, knuckles white with tension. She'd seen troubled students before, but this was different. Grayson moved to Malik's bedside, crouching down to meet the boy's eye level. The thin mattress barely dipped under Malik's weight. He was far too light for a 10-year-old. His eyes were open now, but distant, fixed on the ceiling tiles above. "Kid," Grayson's voice was gentle, careful not to startle him. "Tell me the truth." He waited, watching as Malik's fingers twisted in the thin sheet covering him. The boy's breathing hitched slightly, a small tell that revealed his inner struggle. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the school beyond the office door. Malik's eyes remained fixed upward, as if the answers he sought might be written somewhere in the fluorescent lights above. Then, so quietly that Grayson had to lean closer to hear, Malik whispered, "I don't want to go back." His voice cracked on the last word, heavy with fear and exhaustion, and a desperation that no child should know. Those 6 words carried the weight of countless silent meals, cold nights, and lonely walks. They held all the truth that Grayson had suspected but couldn't prove, all the pain that Malik had been forced to hide. That evening, as darkness settled over the suburban streets, Grayson's patrol car cut through the quiet neighborhood like an avenging angel. He didn't bother calling ahead, didn't wait for backup or warrants or permission. The time for procedure was over. The Holloway house stood pristine as ever, its windows glowing with warm light, a perfect facade hiding its toxic core. Grayson's boots hit the concrete steps hard as he strode to the front door. His knuckles rapped against the wood with controlled force, not a polite knock but a demand. Brenda Holloway opened the door, her face arranged in a mask of surprise. She wore an expensive sweater and perfect makeup, every inch the concerned foster mother. "Officer Grayson?" "What a surprise." Her act might have fooled others, but Grayson saw through it now. He saw the calculation behind her wide eyes, the tension in her perfectly relaxed pose. Tom appeared behind her, his broad frame filling the doorway. His arms crossed over his chest, a subtle display of dominance. "Officer, is there a problem?" His voice carried just the right note of confusion, of innocent concern. Grayson stood his ground, his badge catching the porch light. His eyes moved between them, taking in their practiced poses, their rehearsed concern. He thought of Malik, lying pale and weak in the nurse's office, finally speaking the truth they had tried so hard to silence. "Yeah," Grayson replied, his voice hard with certainty. "There is." He stepped forward, forcing them to give ground. His presence filled the doorway, immovable as stone. The time for watching and waiting was over. He wasn't leaving without Malik. Grayson stood at the Holloway's front door, his body rigid with determination. The porch light cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of anger around his mouth. He'd seen enough suffering in his years on the force, but something about this case had gotten under his skin, had awakened a protective fury he couldn't ignore. Brenda Holloway's perfectly made-up face arranged itself into an expression of motherly concern. Her designer sweater and pearl earrings completed the picture of suburban perfection she worked so hard to maintain. "Oh, officer, is something wrong with Malik?" Her voice dripped with honey-sweet worry, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. Tom Holloway positioned himself slightly in front of his wife, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive stance. His broad shoulders filled the doorframe, a subtle attempt at intimidation that might have worked on someone else. But Grayson had faced down worse in his career, and tonight he wasn't backing down. "We take good care of him," Tom declared, his tone carrying a hint of warning. "The boy has a history of exaggerating. You should see his file from the previous homes." From his position on the staircase, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, Malik listened with his heart hammering against his ribs. His thin fingers gripped the wooden banister, knuckles white with tension. He'd seen this scene play out before in other homes, concerned adults asking questions, his foster parents spinning their web of lies, and eventually, everyone believing them instead of him. Grayson took a deliberate step forward, forcing the Holloways to give ground. He collapsed from hunger today. His voice remained steady, controlled, but his eyes blazed with barely contained anger. The words hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to their carefully constructed facade. The tension in the entryway thickened as Tom let out a dismissive scoff. "He eats here every night." He gestured toward their immaculate dining room, where expensive plates still sat from dinner, a dinner Malik hadn't been allowed to touch. "We're not monsters, officer. Maybe you should ask him why he doesn't eat the food we provide." Grayson's jaw tightened. He lowered his voice, each word precise and cutting. "I know what you're doing." His eyes moved between Tom and Brenda, letting them see the certainty in his gaze. "I've been watching. 20 miles to school every day on foot. No breakfast, no lunch money. While your own kids ride in comfort." A flicker of something, fear perhaps or anger, crossed Brenda's face, causing her practiced smile to waver. But she recovered quickly, moving with purposeful steps to retrieve a folder from a nearby table. Her manicured nails flipped through papers with practiced efficiency. "His grades are good," she pointed out, holding up recent report cards. "He's well-dressed." She gestured to Malik's clothes, which were actually hand-me-downs from their biological children. "You think social services will take him away because he skipped breakfast?" Her tone carried a note of triumph, knowing she had the law on her side. Grayson felt the frustration building in his chest. She was right. Legally, neglect was hard to prove without concrete evidence. Hungry children could be explained away. Missing meals could be blamed on the child's choices. Without visible bruises or documented abuse, the system would likely side with the foster parents, especially ones who looked as perfect on paper as the Holloways. But the memory of Malik lying unconscious in the nurse's office, his body far too light and fragile, burned in Grayson's mind. He thought of all the mornings he'd watched the boy trudge along dangerous roads, all the times he'd seen him flinch at Tom's touch, all the silent meals where he sat with an empty plate while the family ate around him. His gaze shifted to where Malik stood in the hallway, a small figure half hidden in shadow. The boy's eyes were wide with a mixture of hope and terror, his thin frame tense as if ready to run. Grayson softened his voice, speaking directly to him now, ignoring the Holloway's presence entirely. "You don't have to stay here," he said softly, letting his concern and sincerity show plainly on his face. "You don't deserve this." The words carried the weight of a promise, an offer of safety that Malik had never truly known. Malik's eyes met Grayson's for a brief moment before dropping to the floor. His hands twisted in the hem of his worn shirt, a nervous gesture that spoke volumes about his inner turmoil. He wanted to believe the officer, wanted desperately to trust that this time would be different, that this adult might actually follow through on their promises of protection. But fear was louder than hope. Fear of the unknown, fear of retaliation, fear of ending up somewhere even worse. These thoughts played across his face as he stood frozen in the hallway, caught between the devil he knew and the uncertainty of escape. Hours later, the silence in Malik's room was deafening. He lay on his thin mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling while his stomach twisted with familiar hunger pangs. The Holloways hadn't said a word when they locked him in. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke volumes, a punishment more effective than any shouting could be. The room felt smaller than usual, its walls pressing in around him. A single streetlight filtered through his window, casting strange shadows across the bare walls. There were no posters, no toys, no signs that a child lived here. Just an old dresser with 3 drawers that didn't quite close, and a bed with springs that dug into his back. The lock clicked heavily into place hours ago, and Malik had counted every tick of the ancient clock down the hall since then. Each second stretched longer than the last, marked by the growling of his empty stomach. He'd learned not to cry during these punishments. Crying only made the thirst worse, and he needed to conserve what little water they gave him. When morning finally came, Malik heard Brenda's footsteps approaching his door. The lock turned, and he tensed, expecting her to enter, but she didn't. Instead, he heard the soft clink of a tray being set down, followed by her retreating steps. Malik waited until he was sure she was gone before crawling out of bed. His legs felt weak, shaky from hunger, and a night spent tossing and turning. When he opened the door, he found exactly what he expected. A single glass of water on a metal tray. No food, no note. Just clear water that seemed to mock him with its inadequacy. He picked up the glass carefully, knowing he needed to make it last. The water was room temperature and tasted slightly metallic, but he forced himself to take only small sips. Who knew when he'd get more? Back on his bed, Malik returned to his ceiling gazing, though his thoughts wandered to Officer Grayson. The cop's words from last night echoed in his head. "You don't have to stay here." But where else could he go? The streets? Another foster home that might be even worse? At least here, he knew what to expect. He knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, how to make himself invisible when Tom was in a mood. Running away meant uncertainty. It meant possibly ending up in one of those group homes the Holloways always threatened him with, or worse, being sent back to them with an added layer of punishment for trying to escape. No, running wasn't an option. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The morning dragged on, and eventually, the Holloways unlocked his door for school. Malik gathered his worn backpack, his movements slow and careful to conserve energy. He'd learned to function on empty, but today felt different, heavier. The weight of last night's confrontation hung over him like a storm cloud. The walk to school seemed longer than usual. Each step required more effort, his legs feeling like they were moving through mud. The early morning air bit at his exposed skin. They'd taken his hoodie as part of the punishment, leaving him with just a thin t-shirt against the cold. When the school finally came into view, Malik's heart sank. Officer Grayson's patrol car was parked out front, and the officer himself stood leaning against it, scanning the arriving students. Malik kept his head down, hoping to slip past unnoticed, but his sluggish movements betrayed him. "Morning, kid," Grayson's voice carried across the schoolyard, gentle but firm. Malik couldn't avoid responding without drawing attention. "Morning," he muttered, the word coming out hollow and flat. He didn't lift his eyes from the ground, didn't want to see the concern or pity that he knew would be in the officer's face. Grayson's shoes appeared in Malik's downcast field of vision as the officer approached. He noticed how Malik's shoulders slumped forward, how his steps dragged across the pavement. The boy looked even more exhausted than usual, if that was possible. His jaw clenched as he recognized the signs of punishment, the missing jacket, the careful movements, the way Malik seemed to curl in on himself even more than usual. Later that night, after his shift, Grayson sat in his home office surrounded by stacks of papers and his glowing computer screen. He'd called in a favor from Sarah, an old friend in social services who owed him one. The files she sent over made his stomach turn. The Holloways had been foster parents for 8 years. On paper, they looked perfect. Middle-class income, stable marriage, good neighborhood. But as Grayson dug deeper, patterns emerged. Kids who stayed briefly before being moved for behavioral issues. Medical reports noting weight loss and unexplained injuries. Complaints that were investigated and dismissed due to lack of evidence. One name kept appearing in the reports: Marcus Chen, age 12, placed with the Holloways 3 years ago. Multiple emergency room visits for accidents, sudden withdrawal from school, transferred to another home after 4 months with no explanation in the file. Another child, Sofia Rodriguez, age 9, reported running away twice. Notes about stealing food and lying about meals. Removed from the home when a teacher reported concerns about malnutrition. The list went on. Different names, different years, but the same story playing out over and over. The Holloways had perfected their system, keeping the abuse just below the threshold of provable neglect, maintaining a spotless public image, choosing victims who were least likely to be believed. Grayson's hands shook as he read through another file. James Turner, age 11. Frequent unauthorized absences from school. Problems with food hoarding. Removed at foster parents' request due to behavioral concerns. The clinical language couldn't hide the truth. These were children being systematically abused while the system looked the other way. What made his blood run cold wasn't just the abuse itself, but how long it had been allowed to continue. 8 years. How many kids had suffered in that house while people who should have protected them turned a blind eye? How many reports had been filed and dismissed? How many children had learned, like Malik, that asking for help only made things worse? Malik wasn't the first child the Holloways had hurt, but Grayson made a silent promise as he stared at the damning evidence before him. He would be the last. Grayson burst through the doors of the social services office, his footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway. The manila folder in his hand felt like it weighed a ton, packed with evidence he'd spent nights gathering. His jaw was set with determination as he approached the front desk, badge already out. "I need to speak with Sarah Martinez immediately," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "It's about the Holloway case." The receptionist glanced up, recognizing him from his previous visits. She pressed a button on her phone, murmuring into it quietly. A few moments later, Sarah appeared, looking tired and overworked as usual. Her business suit was slightly wrinkled and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "Officer Grayson," she said, gesturing toward her office. "Come in." Inside her cramped office, surrounded by towering filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork, Grayson didn't waste time with pleasantries. He dropped the folder on her desk, spreading out the documents he'd collected. "I found them," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 2 former foster kids, Marcus Chen and Sofia Rodriguez, both placed with the Holloways. Both reported abuse. Sarah picked up the first report, her eyes scanning the details. Grayson continued, pointing to specific passages he'd highlighted. Marcus ran away 3 times. When they caught him, he told the juvenile detention officers about the food deprivation, the psychological abuse, but nobody believed him. They labeled him a troubled kid and buried his complaints. He pulled out another document. And Sofia, she tried to tell her teacher, said they were starving her, treating her like she wasn't human. The Holloways convinced everyone she was lying for attention. She disappeared into the system after that. Nobody followed up. Sarah's face grew more troubled as she read, but when she looked up, her expression was resigned. "Officer Grayson, I understand what you're showing me, but… She paused, choosing her words carefully. Without physical evidence or Malik speaking out directly, they won't approve an emergency removal. Grayson's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he struggled to keep his voice level. So what? He has to be bruised or dead before you act? Sarah looked away, unable to meet his fierce gaze. The truth in his words hung heavy in the air between them. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the report, a nervous habit betraying her discomfort with the situation. The system has protocols, she said weakly. Without current evidence… Protocols? Grayson cut her off, his voice rising. These kids were crying for help. The evidence was there, but nobody wanted to see it. And now Malik's trapped in the same nightmare. He pulled out his phone, his movements sharp with frustration. His fingers jabbed at the screen as he dialed the school nurse's number. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Officer Grayson," he said, his tone all business now. "I need a record of every time Malik has come in hungry or sick. Every incident, every complaint, every observation you've made. Can you get that to me today?" He listened for a moment, nodding. "Yes, everything. And if you've noticed any patterns, anything that seemed off, I need it all." Another pause. "Thank you. I'll pick it up in an hour." Sarah watched him end the call, her expression a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "Daniel," she said softly, using his first name, "I want to help. But you know how this works. The Holloways know exactly how far they can push without crossing legal lines. They've been doing this for years." "Then we'll find new lines," Grayson replied, gathering his documents back into the folder. "Because I'm not letting them hurt another kid." Miles away in the Holloway house, Malik lay in his bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling. His stomach cramped painfully. Dinner had been a single slice of white bread again, and his body screamed for more sustenance. He counted the minutes, waiting until the house fell completely silent. The kitchen was directly below his room. He'd learned to recognize the different creaks and groans of the floorboards, could tell when everyone was truly asleep. Finally, when midnight had come and gone, Malik eased himself out of bed. He'd practiced this movement countless times, knowing exactly how to distribute his weight to prevent any noise. His sock-covered feet moved silently across the floor as he crept toward his door. The hallway was dark, but his eyes had adjusted. He knew to avoid the third step from the bottom. It squeaked. The banister was loose on the right side. Don't touch it. Every movement was calculated, born from desperate necessity and painful experience. The kitchen tile was cold under his feet. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the counter. Malik's heart pounded as he approached the bread box. Just one piece. They might not notice. His fingers reached out, trembling slightly. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Tom's voice rumbled from the darkness like distant thunder. Malik's whole body went rigid, his hand frozen in mid-reach. The kitchen suddenly seemed much colder, the shadows deeper and more threatening. Heavy footsteps approached from behind him. Malik didn't turn around. He couldn't. Fear held him in place like concrete around his feet. Tom's presence loomed closer, bringing with it the faint smell of cigarettes and aftershave. "That cop's gonna get tired of you," Tom continued, his voice low and menacing. "And when he does, you'll have no one." Malik's shoulders hunched forward, making himself smaller. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The kitchen suddenly felt like a trap, with Tom blocking the only exit. Malik started to speak, but his voice failed him. "You what?" Tom's tone carried a warning. "You thought Officer Friendly was going to save you? That he actually cares?" Malik lowered his head, staring at the floor. He wanted to believe in Grayson. The officer had shown more concern for him than any adult in years. But Tom's words found the cracks in his hope, seeping in like poison. What if Grayson did give up? What if this was all temporary? Just another adult who would eventually decide Malik wasn't worth the trouble. The thought made his chest tight with fear. Tom stepped closer, his shadow completely engulfing Malik's smaller frame. "Remember what I told you about people like him? They make promises. They act like they care. Then they leave you worse off than before. The sky was still dark when Grayson parked his patrol car outside the Holloway house. He'd positioned himself where he could see the front door clearly, engine off, waiting. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he watched the first hints of dawn creep over the horizon. At exactly 5:45 a.m., the front door opened. Malik emerged, moving slower than usual. His backpack hung heavy on his thin shoulders, and his steps were unsteady. Even from this distance, Grayson could see the exhaustion in every movement. Grayson didn't hesitate. He stepped out of his car, the door closing with a soft thud in the quiet morning air. Malik froze at the sound, his whole body tensing like a startled deer. "Get in," Grayson said, his voice gentle but firm. He opened the passenger door, letting the warmth from the car's heater spill out into the cold morning air. Malik stood rooted to the spot, his breath visible in small, rapid puffs. His eyes darted between Grayson, the car, and the house behind him. This was it, the point of no return. Everything would change with this one decision. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of early morning traffic. Grayson didn't move, didn't pressure. He just waited, letting Malik make the choice. Finally, Malik took a step forward, then another. His movements were cautious, like he expected someone to burst out of the house and stop him at any moment. When he reached the car, he paused again, one hand gripping the doorframe. "It's okay," Grayson said softly. "You're safe now." Malik slid into the passenger seat, his backpack clutched tight against his chest like a shield. As soon as Grayson closed the door, Malik exhaled sharply, a sound like he'd been holding his breath for years. The tension in his shoulders didn't completely disappear, but something in his face changed, like a prisoner seeing daylight for the first time in months. They drove in silence. Grayson kept his eyes on the road, but he could see Malik in his peripheral vision, watching the Holloway house shrink in the rearview mirror. The boy's hands gradually loosened their death grip on his backpack. His breathing became slower, steadier. For the first time, Malik looked like he was escaping rather than just surviving. The police station was quiet this early in the morning. Grayson led Malik through the back entrance, away from the usual bustle of the front desk. He brought him to the break room, which was empty except for the soft hum of the vending machines. "Wait here," Grayson said, pulling out a chair at one of the small tables. He went to his locker first, retrieving the paper bag he'd packed the night before. Then he stopped at the break room's mini kitchen, pulling out plates and utensils. From the bag, he produced a breakfast sandwich he'd picked up on his way to work, still warm in its wrapper, and an apple. When he set the plate in front of Malik, the boy just stared at it. His hands remained in his lap, though Grayson could see his fingers twitching slightly. He didn't reach for the food, didn't make any move to eat. Instead, he sat perfectly still as if expecting someone to snatch the plate away at any moment. Grayson's heart cracked a little more. He'd seen this before in abuse cases, in trauma victims, the hesitation, the disbelief, the fear that any kindness might be a trick. "It's yours," Grayson said quietly, pulling up a chair across from him. "All of it. You can eat whenever you're ready." Malik's eyes flickered between the food and Grayson's face, searching for any sign of deception. His stomach growled audibly, but still he waited. "I won't take it away," Grayson added, keeping his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. Not at Malik, but at the people who had taught him to be so afraid of eating. Finally, slowly, Malik reached for the sandwich. His first bite was tiny, cautious. When nothing bad happened, he took another, slightly bigger. Soon, he was eating with the quiet desperation of someone who didn't know when their next meal would come. Grayson wanted to tell him to slow down, that he might make himself sick, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything that might make Malik stop eating. Instead, he just watched, silently promising himself that this kid would never go hungry again. When Malik finished, he carefully wiped his hands on a napkin and gathered the wrapper, like he was trying to erase any evidence that he'd eaten. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. That night, Malik didn't return to the Holloway house. Instead, he found himself in a small but clean room at the emergency children's shelter. The bed wasn't fancy, but it had thick blankets and a proper pillow. The room was warm, actually warm. not the biting cold he'd grown used to. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the blanket. It felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. But the warmth was real. The full feeling in his stomach from dinner was real. The lock on his door that he could control from the inside, that was real too. For the first time in years, Malik lay down in a warm bed, in a safe place. His body slowly relaxed into the mattress, the constant tension in his muscles finally beginning to ease. The room was quiet except for the soft whir of the heating vent, and no footsteps approached his door. In the hallway, Grayson spoke quietly with the shelter staff, making sure they understood Malik's situation. He'd stay close, keep watch, make sure nothing went wrong. Because even though Malik was safe for tonight, even though he was finally away from the Holloways, Grayson knew the battle for custody was just beginning. Days later, Malik woke with a start, his heart racing before he remembered where he was. Sunlight filtered through unfamiliar curtains, casting warm patterns across a bed that wasn't his usual threadbare mattress. The room at the temporary foster shelter felt almost too comfortable. The blankets too soft, the air too warm, the silence too peaceful. He sat up slowly, running his hand over the clean sheets. No springs poking through, no cold draft, no footsteps in the hallway that made his stomach clench with dread. But even in this safety, fear lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. The Holloways had connections. They knew people in the system. What if they found a way to take him back? The thought made his hands tremble. He'd seen them do it before, with other foster kids who tried to speak up. Somehow they always managed to make everything look perfect on paper. And the kids always came back. Always. Across town at the police station, Officer Grayson sat at his desk, reviewing his notes on Malik's case. He'd documented everything: the 20-mile walks to school, the collapsed from hunger, the pattern of neglect. But before he could finish his report, a voice cut through his concentration. "Grayson, Captain's office. Now." The tone made his stomach sink. He knew that tone. It meant trouble. Inside the captain's office, the atmosphere was tense. Captain Rivera sat behind his desk, his expression grim. A manila folder lay open in front of him. "The Holloways filed a kidnapping complaint against you this morning," Rivera said without preamble. "They're claiming you illegally removed their foster child from their care." Grayson's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. The boy was being starved." "Without proof of immediate danger, you had no authority to remove him," Rivera cut in. "You know the protocol. Child Services hasn't approved this placement." "He collapsed at school from hunger," Grayson argued, his voice rising. "How much more immediate danger do you need? The Holloways have documentation showing regular medical checkups, good school attendance, even therapy sessions." Rivera pushed the folder across his desk. "On paper, they look like model foster parents." "It's all fake," Grayson snapped. "They're manipulating the system." "The department can't get involved in custody disputes," Rivera said firmly. "You need to return the boy until the court makes a decision." Grayson stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "You want me to take him back to the people who are abusing him?" "I want you to follow procedure," Rivera replied, his tone warning. "Don't make this worse than it already is." The drive to the foster shelter felt like the longest of Grayson's life. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he tried to control his anger. He couldn't take Malik back. He wouldn't. Inside the shelter's small meeting room, Malik sat across from him, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. When Grayson explained the situation, Malik didn't look surprised, just resigned, like he'd been expecting this all along. "They'll win," Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. "They always do." The defeat in his voice made Grayson's chest ache. This kid had been let down by every adult who was supposed to protect him. Every system that should have helped him had failed. "Listen to me," Grayson said, leaning forward. "I can't let them take you back. I won't." Malik finally looked up, a flicker of hope crossing his face before doubt shadowed it again. "But the police—" "I don't care what they say," Grayson interrupted. "Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules." He pulled out his phone, already dialing his lawyer's number. The Holloways wanted a legal battle? Fine. He'd give them one. Within hours, Grayson filed for emergency custody. His lawyer worked quickly, submitting documentation of Malik's collapse at school, statements from the school nurse about his recurring malnutrition, and testimony from teachers who had noticed his declining condition. The Holloways fought back immediately. Their response was swift and vicious. They painted Malik as a troubled child with behavioral issues, claiming he refused to eat at home and made up stories for attention. They produced carefully crafted records showing regular meals, medical care, and counseling sessions. The system was stacked against them. Foster parents like the Holloways knew how to work it, knew exactly what documentation to have, what stories to tell. They had years of experience making everything look perfect on paper while hiding the truth behind closed doors. But Grayson refused to back down. He sat in his lawyer's office reviewing their strategy for the upcoming hearing. The Holloways had money and influence, but Grayson had something they didn't: the truth. And he would fight with everything he had to make sure that truth came out. "They're going to try to discredit you," his lawyer warned. "They'll say you overstepped your authority, that you're obsessed with this case." "Let them," Grayson replied, his voice hard. "I've got witnesses. I've got documentation. And most importantly, I've got Malik." Back at the shelter, Malik sat on his bed, knees pulled up to his chest. The uncertainty of his situation weighed heavy on him. But for the first time in years, he wasn't facing it alone. Someone was finally fighting for him. Someone finally cared enough to stand up to the Holloways. He thought about Grayson's words from earlier. "I won't let them take you back." No adult had ever made him that promise before. No one had ever chosen to fight for him instead of looking the other way. The legal papers sat on the shelter director's desk, emergency custody forms with Grayson's name on them. It wasn't just words anymore. It was action. It was someone putting everything on the line to protect him. The battle ahead would be hard. The Holloways would fight dirty. They'd try to destroy Grayson's career, try to paint Malik as a liar. The system that had failed Malik so many times before still stood between them and justice. But something had changed. For the first time, Malik wasn't just running away from something. He was running toward something, toward safety, toward hope, toward someone who refused to give up on him. The Holloways' influence ran deep in the foster care system. Their perfectly maintained records and professional connections made them seem untouchable. But Grayson had seen through their facade, and he wouldn't stop until everyone else did too. Days later, the small courtroom felt suffocating as Malik sat beside Officer Grayson, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The wooden bench was hard and uncomfortable, but that wasn't why he couldn't stop fidgeting. Across the aisle, Tom and Brenda Holloway sat with perfect posture, wearing their Sunday best, their expressions a masterful blend of concern and injured innocence. Their lawyer, Mr. Peterson, stood at the podium, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of an officer overstepping his bounds. Officer Grayson has developed an unhealthy fixation on this case, removing a child from a loving home based on nothing but speculation and personal bias." Malik's stomach churned as he watched the judge's face. Judge Martinez's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of skepticism in her eyes as she glanced between Grayson and the Holloways. "The Holloways have been foster parents for over a decade," Peterson continued, shuffling through his papers. "They've opened their home to dozens of children. Their record is impeccable. They've provided Malik with everything he needs: a warm bed, regular meals, emotional support." Malik wanted to scream at the lies, but he stayed silent. He'd learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse. "Furthermore," Peterson gestured toward Malik, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "we have to consider Malik's history of behavioral issues. Children from traumatic backgrounds often struggle with truth-telling. They seek attention through negative behaviors." Brenda Holloway dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "We just want what's best for him," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. "We've tried so hard to help him adjust." The judge turned to Grayson's lawyer, Ms. Chen. "Your response?" Grayson stood, his jaw set with determination. He moved to the front of the courtroom, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. Malik walked 20 miles to school every day because the Holloways wouldn't drive him or let him take the bus. He collapsed from malnutrition in class. He laid out photograph after photograph. Malik's threadbare clothes compared to the Holloway children's designer brands, medical records showing his weight loss, school nurse reports documenting his frequent visits for hunger-related symptoms. "We have testimony from multiple witnesses," Grayson continued, his voice growing more intense. "The school nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, will confirm that Malik showed signs of chronic malnutrition." Mrs. Rodriguez took the stand, her kind face serious as she described Malik's condition. "He was severely dehydrated, undernourished. When I asked him about meals at home, he would change the subject or say he wasn't hungry." Malik's English teacher, Mr. Bennett, testified next. "He would fall asleep in class from exhaustion. Sometimes his hands would shake so badly he couldn't hold his pencil. When I offered him food, he'd eat like he hadn't seen food in days." But as each witness finished, Malik could see the judge's expression remaining uncertain. The Holloway's lawyer had an answer for everything. The long walks? Malik chose to walk because he enjoyed the exercise. The hunger? He refused to eat at home and they couldn't force him. The weight loss? A growth spurt combined with picky eating habits. Peterson produced documents showing regular doctor visits, counseling sessions, and detailed logs of meals served. Everything looked perfect on paper. Every base was covered. Every explanation was reasonable. Judge Martinez rubbed her temples, looking between the two parties. "While I'm concerned about some of the allegations presented here, the law requires clear and convincing evidence of abuse or neglect for permanent removal from a foster home." Malik's heart sank. He knew what was coming. "The documentation provided by the Holloways shows consistent medical care and attention to Malik's needs," the judge continued. "Without direct proof of abuse or neglect, I cannot justify permanent removal at this time." Brenda Holloway's shoulders relaxed slightly. Tom's mouth twitched into the ghost of a smile. "However," Judge Martinez added, "I am ordering weekly visits from a social worker and mandatory counseling sessions for Malik. We will review this case in 30 days. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like a prison door closing. Malik will return to the Holloway home pending further review. The room spun around Malik. He felt sick, trapped. The Holloways would be even worse now. They'd make him pay for every word spoken against them in this courtroom. As people began to file out, Grayson crouched down beside Malik's chair. His hand gripped Malik's shoulder firmly, steadying him. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We're going to keep fighting. I promise you that." Malik nodded, but inside, hope was crumbling. He'd seen this before. The Holloways always won. They knew exactly how to play the game, how to make everything look perfect on the surface while hiding the rot underneath. That night, Malik stood in his old room at the Holloway house. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The thin mattress, the empty dresser, the cold draft from the window that never quite closed properly. The house felt like a tomb, silent except for the sound of his own breathing. He sat on the edge of the bed, his backpack still clutched in his hands. Down the hall, he could hear the Holloway's biological children laughing, the clink of plates as they ate dinner. No one had called him to join them. No one had acknowledged him since they'd walked through the door. He was back, trapped, again. The darkness pressed in around him as he lay down, still fully dressed. He didn't bother getting under the covers. He knew from experience they'd only be taken away later as punishment. Officer Grayson's words echoed in his head. This isn't over. But in the suffocating silence of the Holloway house, those words felt hollow. Everything that had felt possible in the shelter, safety, hope, belonging, seemed like a distant dream now. The floorboards creaked outside his door. Malik tensed, waiting. But no one came in. They didn't need to. They had won, and they knew it. They had the law on their side, the system working in their favor. All they had to do now was wait for Officer Grayson to give up, just like everyone else had. The heavy front door of the Holloway house closed behind Malik with a final sounding click. The familiar musty smell hit him first, a mix of artificial air freshener and something else, something that always made his skin crawl. The living room looked exactly the same as when he'd left. Pristine furniture, family photos where he never appeared. expensive decorations that he wasn't allowed to touch. But the air felt different, heavier, dangerous. Tom and Brenda's courthouse masks had crumbled the moment they'd stepped inside. Their perfectly practiced smiles vanished, replaced by cold, hard stares that made Malik's chest tighten. He stood in the entryway, his backpack clutched close, trying to make himself as small as possible. Brenda moved closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She leaned down, her breath hot against his ear. "You humiliated us in court." Her whisper carried more venom than any shout. "Made us look like monsters in front of everyone." Malik kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his heart hammering. He'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Silence was safer, always safer. Tom's heavy footsteps echoed through the house as he walked to the kitchen. The sound of keys jingling made Malik look up. Tom was at the refrigerator, fitting a padlock through the handles. "You'll eat when we say you can," Tom said, his voice flat and final. He turned, holding out his hand. "Backpack, now." Malik's fingers tightened on the straps. His backpack was the only thing he truly owned, filled with borrowed library books and a few precious snacks he'd managed to save from school. "Now," Tom repeated, his tone dropping dangerously. With trembling hands, Malik handed over his backpack. Tom immediately walked to the garage with it, probably to lock it away with everything else they'd taken from him over the months. Brenda's perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around Malik's arm, her grip painful. "Shoes too," she said, her voice sugary sweet, but her eyes hard as steel. "You won't be needing those anymore. No more of your little morning walks." Malik slipped off his worn sneakers, the only pair he owned. Brenda snatched them up, disappearing down the hallway with them. The message was clear. He was trapped. No shoes, no backpack, no way out. The house felt like it was shrinking around him, the walls closing in. The Holloway children watched from the top of the stairs, their expressions a mix of smugness and practiced indifference. They'd seen this before with other foster kids who'd tried to speak up. "Go to your room," Tom ordered, returning from the garage. "No dinner tonight, or tomorrow. We'll decide when you've learned your lesson." Malik climbed the stairs slowly, his sock-covered feet silent on the carpeted steps. His room, if you could call it that, was at the end of the hall, as far from the family's bedrooms as possible. The door didn't have a lock, but he knew better than to close it. They hated when he closed it. Hours passed. Night fell. The sounds of the Holloway family's dinner drifted up, the clinking of plates, the murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh. Malik lay on his bed, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He'd gotten used to regular meals during his brief stay at the shelter. Now his body was reminding him painfully of what he was missing. The house grew quiet as bedtime approached, but then new sounds emerged, angry whispers from downstairs growing louder. Malik crept to his doorway, listening. "That cop thinks he can just walk in here and take him?" Brenda's voice was shrill with fury. "Who does he think he is?" "He's nothing," Tom responded, his tone cold and calculated. "Just some bleeding heart who'll lose interest soon enough. They always do." "Over my dead body will he take this one?" Brenda hissed. "We've worked too hard to build this life. One foster brat isn't going to ruin everything." Their voices moved to the kitchen, becoming muffled, but Malik had heard enough. A cold realization settled over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just punishment anymore. This was something worse. They weren't going to let him leave. Not ever. They'd keep him locked away, isolated, until Officer Grayson gave up. They'd make sure no one ever believed him again. They'd break him down until he stopped fighting, just like they'd done with the others. Malik retreated to his bed, his mind racing. The darkness pressed in around him, but he couldn't sleep. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, the same thought repeating over and over in his mind. "I have to run." The words echoed in his head like a drumbeat. Run. 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 But how? They'd taken his shoes, his backpack, everything he could use. The windows were nailed shut. He'd discovered that months ago. They'd be watching him closer than ever now. Still, the thought wouldn't leave him. It grew stronger with each passing hour, with each creak of the house settling around him. I have to run, because if he stayed, he knew what would happen. They'd wear him down bit by bit until there was nothing left of him, until he became just another silent, broken kid in their perfect fake family. The moon cast long shadows through his window as Malik lay there, his mind filled with that single, desperate thought. I have to run. The digital clock on Malik's nightstand blinked 3 a.m. in harsh red numbers. His eyes snapped open, heart already racing before his mind fully registered why. The house creaked and settled around him, but underneath those familiar sounds was something else. A certainty that had crystallized during his sleepless hours. Now or never. His hands trembled as he pushed back the thin blanket. The floor was ice cold against his bare feet, but he didn't dare put on socks. Every sound seemed magnified in the pre-dawn silence. Even his breathing felt too loud. Malik stood completely still, listening. Down the hall, he could hear Tom's heavy snoring. The rest of the house was quiet. No late-night TV, no whispered conversations, no footsteps. Moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be invisible, Malik crept to the window. The Holloways had nailed it shut months ago, but they hadn't checked it recently. For weeks, Malik had been slowly, painstakingly working the nails loose whenever he was alone in his room. Just in case. Just for a night like this. His fingers found the bottom edge of the window frame. The first push did nothing. The second made the wood creak slightly. Malik froze, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Tom's snoring continued uninterrupted. One more try. He pressed upward with all his strength, keeping the pressure steady to minimize noise. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a barely audible pop, the window slid up an inch. Cold February air rushed in through the gap. Malik shivered in his thin t-shirt and pajama pants, but he didn't dare try to find warmer clothes. The Holloways had locked away most of his possessions anyway. Besides, any detour would just increase his chances of getting caught. The window opened wider, each inch a silent victory. When the gap was big enough, Malik peered out into the darkness. The ground below seemed impossibly far away, though he knew it was only the second floor. The bushes Mrs. Holloway was so proud of lined the house, thorny things that she claimed kept burglars away. Tonight they might actually help him. Malik swung one leg over the windowsill, then the other. The cold bit through his thin clothes. He clung to the frame, heart thundering in his chest as he looked down at the shadows below. What if he broke something? What if he couldn't run? What if dash? Number no more what-ifs. Better to die trying than live like this. He let go. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. The bushes caught him with thorny arms, scratching his skin but breaking his fall. Malik tumbled through the branches and landed hard on the frozen ground, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then survival instinct kicked in, and he scrambled to his feet. His bare feet stung against the icy pavement as he started running. He made it halfway down the street before the porch light flicked on behind him. "Malik!" Tom's voice boomed through the quiet neighborhood. Heavy footsteps pounded down the front steps. Terror shot through Malik's body like electricity. He ran faster, his feet numb against the cold ground. The woods at the end of the street beckoned, dark and wild and hopefully too thick for Tom to follow. Behind him he heard the sound of running feet getting closer. Tom was bigger, stronger, and wearing shoes. But Malik had desperation on his side. He dove into the tree line without hesitation. Branches whipped at his face and arms. Thorns and rocks cut into his feet. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. The darkness swallowed him as he pushed deeper into the woods, lungs burning, fear driving him forward. Tom's crashing footsteps followed, accompanied by cursing and the snap of breaking branches. "When I catch you." The threat hung in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. Malik's foot caught on a root. He stumbled but kept going, ignoring the fresh pain shooting up his ankle. The woods were thick here, the branches creating a maze in the darkness. He changed direction randomly, hoping to lose Tom in the confusion. His chest felt like it was on fire. His legs trembled with each step. But he couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. He'd rather die out here than go back to that house. Suddenly, through the trees ahead, he saw flashing lights. Red and blue strobes cutting through the darkness. A car engine roared, then tires screeched to a halt. And that Malik burst through the underbrush onto what must have been a service road. A police cruiser sat there, lights blazing. The driver's door flew open. Officer Grayson jumped out, his face a mix of relief and fierce determination. "Malik!" Malik stumbled forward, his legs finally giving out. But before he could hit the ground, strong arms caught him. He collapsed against Grayson's chest, and something inside him broke. All the fear, all the pain, all the lonely nights and hungry days came pouring out in desperate sobs. Malik clutched at Grayson's uniform, trembling violently, unable to stop crying. Grayson's arms tightened around him protectively. Without letting go, he half-carried Malik to the passenger side of the cruiser and helped him inside. "You're safe now," Grayson said firmly, closing the door. But even as the warmth of the car surrounded him, even as Grayson got in and started driving, Malik couldn't believe it. Not yet. He'd thought he was safe before, so many times, only to have hope ripped away. So he sat there, shaking, tears still falling silently, waiting for the moment when this too would prove to be just another dream. The highway stretched dark and empty before them as Grayson's patrol car sped through the night. In the passenger seat, Malik huddled beneath an emergency blanket, his small frame still trembling despite the car's heating running at full blast. His bare feet, scratched and bruised from his desperate run through the woods, were tucked up under him. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep it seemed to seep into his bones. But sleep felt impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tom's angry face, heard the heavy footsteps chasing him through the darkness. Grayson kept glancing at him, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the dashboard. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't relaxed since they'd driven away from the woods. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Malik stared out the window, watching the shadows of trees blur past. His mind kept circling back to the Holloways, to what would happen when they caught up with him. Because they would. They always did. "They're going to come after you," Malik whispered, his voice barely audible over the car's engine. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, as if it could shield him from what was coming. Grayson's jaw tightened further, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Let them," he said, and there was something in his voice Malik had never heard before, a fierce protectiveness that made his throat tight with emotion. The lights of the city began to appear on the horizon, breaking through the darkness. Malik watched them grow closer, each mile taking him further from the Holloways, but somehow making his anxiety grow stronger. He knew what happened to kids who ran. He'd heard the stories. The system didn't like troublemakers. When they pulled into the police station parking lot, Malik's heart sank. A social services car was already waiting, its occupants standing in a small group near the entrance. He recognized his caseworker's face in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the parking lot. "No," he whispered, shrinking back in his seat. "Please, I can't. Listen to me," Grayson said, turning to face him fully. "I'm not letting them take you back there. You understand? Not tonight, not ever." Malik wanted to believe him, but he'd heard promises before. They got out of the car, Malik still wrapped in the blanket, his bare feet cold against the concrete. The caseworker stepped forward, her face set in professional concern. "The Holloways reported him as a runaway an hour ago," she said, addressing Grayson rather than Malik. "They're his legal guardians, officer. We need to return him." Grayson moved slightly, positioning himself between Malik and the social workers. "This kid ran away for a reason," he said, his voice hard. "You want to put him back in that house, over my dead body?" The caseworker shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. "You can't keep him, Officer Grayson. That's not how this works. There are procedures, Dash." "Procedures?" Grayson's laugh was bitter. "The same procedures that left him starving, that made him walk 20 miles to school every day? Those procedures?" He reached into his car and pulled out a thick manila folder. I've been building this case for weeks. Every report from his school, every visit to the nurse, statements from teachers who watched him getting thinner and thinner. Reports from previous foster kids who went through the same thing with the Holloways. He thrust the folder at the caseworker. I'm filing for emergency custody right now, tonight. The caseworker flipped through the folder, her expression changing as she read. Another social worker looked over her shoulder, eyebrows rising. This is extensive, she admitted finally. And that's just the beginning, Grayson said. We haven't even gotten to the part where they locked him in his room without food, or nailed his window shut, or took away his shoes so he couldn't run. Malik stood silent through all of this, the blanket clutched around his shoulders like armor. He watched the social workers' faces, looking for signs of disbelief, waiting for them to dismiss everything as lies like they had before. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the thickness of the folder. Maybe it was the authority in Grayson's voice. Maybe it was the sight of Malik himself, barefoot and shivering in the parking lot at midnight. The caseworker closed the folder slowly. We'll need a judge to approve this. Then wake one up, Grayson said flatly, because he's not going back there. Not tonight. Not ever. There was a flurry of phone calls after that. Malik sat in a chair in the station, a cup of hot chocolate growing cold in his hands as adults moved around him, talking in urgent voices. He felt disconnected from it all, like he was watching a movie about someone else's life. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Grayson came and knelt in front of his chair. His face was tired but determined. We're going to court tomorrow, he said softly. The judge agreed to an emergency hearing. This is it, Malik. Your chance to tell them everything. Malik's hands tightened around the paper cup. They never listened before. They will this time, Grayson said, and there was that fierceness again, that absolute certainty that made Malik want to believe. I swear to you, this time, they will listen. Malik looked into Grayson's eyes, searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation. He found none. Just steady determination and something else. Something that looked a lot like the care and protection he'd been searching for his whole life. Slowly, Malik nodded. For the first time since he could remember, he believed it. Really believed it. Tomorrow he would tell his story. And this time, someone would hear him. The courtroom air felt heavy with tension as Malik sat between Grayson and his court-appointed lawyer, Ms. Rodriguez. The polished wooden benches creaked under shifting bodies, and the morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Across the aisle, Tom and Brenda Holloway sat with their expensive attorney, their faces set in practiced expressions of concern. Malik's hands twisted in his lap, his new clothes, bought by Grayson, feeling strange against his skin. He'd never worn anything this nice before. The judge, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, sat above them all, reviewing the thick file of evidence one last time. Ms. Rodriguez stood smoothing her dark blazer. Her heels clicked against the floor as she moved to address the court. Your Honor, the evidence before you today is not just concerning, it's damning. She lifted a stack of papers. We have detailed reports from Lincoln Elementary School documenting Malik's consistent signs of malnutrition. The school nurse treated him for dehydration and hunger-related symptoms no less than 12 times in the past semester alone. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents as Ms. Rodriguez continued. We have testimony from 3 former foster children who were placed with the Holloways. All 3 report similar patterns of neglect, food withheld as punishment, isolation, emotional manipulation. Brenda Holloway shifted in her seat, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wooden barrier in front of her. Tom's face had grown red, but he remained silent. Furthermore, Ms. Rodriguez continued, Officer Grayson's investigation revealed that while the Holloways received $750 per month for Malik's care, they spent less than $50 on his basic needs. No new clothes, no school supplies, minimal food. She turned, gesturing to Malik. This child walked 20 miles to school every day because the Holloways wouldn't drive him or allow him to take the bus. 20 miles, Your Honor, in shoes falling apart at the seams. The courtroom remained silent as Ms. Rodriguez laid out more evidence. Photographs of Malik's sparse room, Medical reports showing his weight loss, statements from teachers who had tried to intervene but were blocked by the Holloway's careful manipulations. Then came the moment Malik had been dreading. Ms. Rodriguez turned to him. "Malik, please take the stand." His legs felt like lead as he stood. Grayson squeezed his shoulder gently as he passed. The witness stand seemed enormous, and Malik felt smaller than ever as he sat down. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, especially the Holloways. "Malik," Ms. Rodriguez said softly, "can you tell the court about your life with the Holloways?" His hands trembled, but his voice came out steady, just as they'd practiced. "They never hit me," he began, looking down at his hands. "That's what they always said when people asked. We don't abuse him." He took a deep breath. "But they didn't feed me either. Not really. I got one meal a day, usually just bread. Sometimes nothing if they were mad at me." "And why would they be mad at you?" Ms. Rodriguez prompted. "If I asked for food, if I took too long walking to school, if I made noise, if their real kids complained about me." Malik's voice grew stronger. "I wasn't their kid. I was their paycheck. That's what Tom said when he thought I couldn't hear." The judge's pen scratched across her notepad as Malik continued. "They bought their kids new clothes and toys. They got good food. But I got nothing. My room didn't even have a heater in winter." From across the courtroom, Tom Holloway suddenly stood up, his face purple with rage. "He's lying," he shouted. "He's just another ungrateful troublemaker. We gave him everything." "Order." The judge's gavel cracked against the wooden block. But Tom wasn't finished. "You don't know what it's like dealing with these kids. They come with problems. They dash." Grayson's chair scraped back as he shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. "You don't own him," his voice thundered through the courtroom. "He is a child, not your property, and you used him. Order in this court." The judge's voice cut through the chaos. Her gavel struck again, harder this time. "Mr. Holloway, sit down or I will have you removed." Tom sank back into his seat, still seething. Brenda touched his arm, her face a mask of false concern. The judge raised her hand for silence, surveying the courtroom with stern eyes. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as she reviewed her notes one final time. Malik held his breath, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, she looked up. "Having reviewed all evidence presented, including testimony from multiple witnesses, school records, medical reports, and Malik's own statement, I am prepared to make my ruling." She paused, her eyes moving from the Holloways to Malik, then to Grayson. "The evidence of neglect in this case is overwhelming. The Holloways have demonstrated a pattern of exploitation and emotional abuse that cannot be ignored." The gavel rose and fell with decisive force. "Malik Holloway is hereby officially removed from the custody of Tom and Brenda Holloway." Malik sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on Officer Grayson's petition and his demonstrated commitment to Malik's welfare, custody is awarded to Officer Daniel Grayson, pending final adoption proceedings. The words seemed to echo in Malik's ears. He barely heard the rest of the judge's statement about the Holloway's foster care license being revoked. He barely registered Tom and Brenda's protests as they were led out of the courtroom. Then Grayson's hand was on his shoulder, warm and steady. "You're coming home, kid," he said softly. Malik's vision blurred as the reality of those words sank in. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a foster kid. He wasn't property. He wasn't a burden. He was someone's son. If you enjoyed the story of Malik, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.